In 2020, Huawei was dead. That was the consensus. The United States had cut it off from TSMC, the Taiwanese chip manufacturer that produced the semiconductors powering its flagship phones. Without TSMC's advanced nodes, Huawei could not make the chips it needed to compete in the premium smartphone market. Its market share in China, which had once made it the dominant force in the world's largest smartphone market, collapsed. Shipments fell off a cliff. The Chinese tech giant that had briefly surpassed Samsung to become the world's largest smartphone manufacturer was suddenly struggling to source the basic components for competitive devices. Washington believed it had solved the Huawei problem. It had not. It had accelerated it. And by July 2026, with the latest market data from IDC and Omdia confirming what had been building for 3 years, the full picture of what Huawei has done since those sanctions hit is one of the most remarkable industrial comebacks in the history of the technology industry, and one of the most consequential competitive threats Apple has faced in any market anywhere on Earth. The story of Huawei's resurrection begins with a single device. In August 2023, Huawei released the Mate 60 Pro, a flagship smartphone that, when semiconductor analysts at Tech Insights tore it down and examined the silicon, contained something the industry had been told was impossible. A domestically manufactured 7mm chip produced by SMIC, China's largest domestic foundry, using a process node that Western officials insisted China could not achieve without access to ASML's advanced EUV lithography machines. SMIC did it without EUV, using older DUV equipment pushed to its limits through multiple patterning techniques that extracted 7nm class performance from machines that were not designed to achieve it. The Kirin 9000S chip inside the Mate 60 Pro was not as efficient or as powerful as what TSMC was, producing at equivalent or smaller nodes, but it was functional. It enabled 5G connectivity, and it proved that China's domestic semiconductor industry had solved a problem that US sanctions had been explicitly designed to make unsolvable. Like and subscribe, because what Huawei built on top of that foundation over the following 3 years is the reason Apple is now staring at its second-place finish in China for the second consecutive year. In 2025, Huawei shipped 46.7 million units in China with a market share of 16.4%, narrowly defeating Apple, which shipped 46.2 million units with a 16.2% share, returning to the top of the Chinese market for the first time in 5 years. The gap was roughly 500,000 units, 0.2 percentage points of market share in a market of 285 million smartphones. Nothing. Almost a rounding error. But in the context of where Huawei had been in 2021 and 2022, when US sanctions had forced it to sell off its Honor sub-brand, to abandon 5G in its flagship devices for 2 full product cycles, and to watch its domestic market share collapse from 1st to 6th place, the significance of that narrow win was not in the numbers. It was in the trajectory. Huawei's market ranking went from 6th in 2023 to 2nd in 2024, and then in 2025, it narrowly defeated Apple, returning to the top of the Chinese market for the first time in 5 years. That 3-year climb, 6th to 2nd to 1st, in a contracting market, against one of the most valuable companies in human history, is not normal competitive dynamics. It is something closer to a military campaign, fought with chips and operating systems and government relationships instead of weapons. The chip story is central to everything else. After the Kirin 9000S proved SMIC could manufacture at 7nm, Huawei iterated rapidly. The Kirin 9020, announced in late 2024 and shipping in the Mate 70 series, is manufactured using SMIC's 7nm N+2 process technology with a fully self-developed CPU architecture featuring big, medium, and small cores, breaking free from reliance on ARM's public version intellectual property. That last point is worth dwelling on. Huawei is not just making its own chips on domestic equipment. It is designing those chips with its own CPU architecture, having been cut off from ARM's standard instruction set licensing by US export controls. The same sanctions that were supposed to stop Huawei from making competitive chips forced Huawei to build the engineering capability to design competitive chips entirely from scratch. The Kirin 9020 paired with Harmony OS 5 delivers a 36% performance improvement over the previous generation. And then came the announcement that the semiconductor industry had not fully anticipated. In May 2026, Huawei board member and semiconductor president He Tingbo introduced what the company called the Tao Law Framework, a new approach to chip design that addresses the fundamental constraint limiting SMIC's manufacturing capability. The new Kirin chip for the Mate 90 series achieves a transistor density leap from 155 million transistors per square millimeter to 238 million transistors per square millimeter, a 53.5% improvement, accomplished not through process node shrinking, but through logic folding, which separates digital, analog, and memory circuits across 2 vertically stacked wafers using ultrafine hybrid bonding. That is a 53% density increase without advancing to a smaller process node. If those specifications are confirmed by independent teardown analysis when the Mate 90 ships, it means Huawei has found an architectural route around the manufacturing constraint that U.S. sanctions were designed to make permanent. While many figured that U.S. sanctions would result in the end of Huawei's smartphone business, the company continues to turn out impressive flagship phones, and Huawei is the global leader in foldables with a top-ranked 48% share of the market. Like and subscribe, because the foldable market leadership is where Huawei's competitive advantage over Apple is most specific and most technically difficult for Apple to respond to. Foldable smartphones, devices with flexible displays that fold to a compact form and unfold to a tablet-sized screen, represent the segment of the premium smartphone market where the highest pricing, the highest margins, and the most aspirational product. Positioning converge. China's foldable phone shipments rose 13% to almost 5 million units in the 6 months ended June 30th, 2025, with 3.74 million being Huawei handsets. That is approximately 75% of all foldable smartphone shipments in China going to Huawei. Apple does not make a foldable device. It has been widely rumored for years to be developing one, but as of mid-2026, no Apple foldable has been announced, no launch date has been confirmed, and no credible supply chain report has established a concrete timeline. Every quarter that passes without Apple entering the foldable category is a quarter in which Huawei solidifies its ownership of the segment that represents the most visible symbol of premium smartphone innovation. Huawei's trifold Mate XTs, a device that folds into 3 sections to create a tablet, experience larger than any conventional foldable, was priced at approximately $2,500 US and sold out in China within hours of its launch. Apple's most expensive iPhone 16 Pro Max starts at less than half that price. The positioning gap between the two companies at the absolute top of the Chinese premium market has inverted from what it was 5 years ago. Harmony OS is reshaping the mobile ecosystem by enabling cross-platform integration with more than 14 million devices using Harmony OS 5. The operating system story is equally consequential. When the US cut Huawei off from Google mobile services and effectively blocked it from the mainstream Android ecosystem, Huawei had to build its own. Harmony OS, initially criticized as a rebranded Android with limited app support, has evolved through 5 major versions into something that analysts now take seriously as a genuine alternative ecosystem. Harmony OS 5 integrates smartphones, laptops, tablets, smartwatches, cars, and home devices into a unified software experience. Harmony OS PCs captured a 12% market share in China's thin and light laptop segment, priced above $8,000 in 2026, a category where Apple's MacBook is the aspirational benchmark. Harmony OS 7, announced alongside the new Mate 90 series, introduces a spatial aesthetics design philosophy. The pace of Harmony OS development, from emergency backup plan to serious ecosystem competitor in 5 years, reflects the same organizational urgency that drove the chip development story. Like and subscribe, because the Q2 2026 data published by IDC in July 2026 shows something that makes the competition between Huawei and Apple in China even more interesting than the full year 2025 numbers suggested. China's smartphone shipments came in at roughly 66 million units in the second quarter of 2026, down 4.3% year over year, in the 5th straight quarter of decline. Huawei and Apple were the exceptions, growing close to 20% and 25% respectively. Apple now has 18.1% of China's smartphone market as of the second quarter of 2026. That's up from 13.9% in the second quarter of 2025 for 24.4% annual growth. The only smartphone company ahead of Apple in the Chinese market is Huawei, which has 22.6% of the market. That data tells a story that is more nuanced than either Huawei is killing Apple or Apple is fine in China. Both companies are growing substantially in a shrinking market. The rest of the field, Xiaomi, Oppo, Vivo, is being squeezed between the 2 premium players at the top. Huawei, Apple, Xiaomi, Oppo, Vivo, and Honor held a 94% market share together in Q1 2026, suggesting Chinese consumers are less and less open to trying out newer or smaller brands. Samsung, which once held a meaningful position in China, has been effectively eliminated, falling into the other category that now accounts for less than Apple's solo market share. The competitive dynamic playing out in China between Huawei and Apple is not simply about which company has the better phone in the abstract sense of specifications, cameras, and user experience. It is about something more politically and economically structural. Chinese nationalism around consumer electronics has been building for years, accelerated by the trade war, the chip sanctions, and the rhetorical framing of technology competition as a proxy for national identity. Huawei has benefited enormously from that sentiment. Its comeback narrative, from sanctions target to domestic champion to market leader, is a story that Chinese media and Chinese consumers have embraced with genuine pride. Apple, by contrast, operates in an environment of increasing scrutiny and occasional government-coordinated campaigns, encouraging Chinese institutions and government employees to use domestic devices rather than iPhones. The Chinese government's ability to influence consumer behavior at scale, through procurement policies, through media messaging, through the subtle social signals of what senior officials and patriotic consumers are seen using, is a competitive variable that does not appear in any IDC market share table, but shapes the underlying dynamics in ways that Apple's product quality and marketing cannot fully counteract. The tariff environment adds another layer of structural risk to Apple's China position. Apple manufactures the vast majority of iPhones in China, primarily through Foxconn and related contractors. The company has been diversifying manufacturing into India and Vietnam, but as of 2026, China remains the dominant production location for the global iPhone supply chain. Any escalation in US-China trade tensions that targets manufacturing or imposes additional export controls on semiconductor equipment or software essential to Apple's supply chain creates risks that Huawei, as a Chinese company manufacturing in China with increasingly domestic components, does not face in the same way. Apple's China exposure is simultaneously its greatest cost advantage and its greatest geopolitical vulnerability, a tension that the company manages with extraordinary diplomatic skill, but that does not disappear. Like and subscribe, because the global picture of this competition, beyond China, is where the full scope of what Huawei is attempting becomes clear. The chips expected to arrive in 2026 with the Mate 90 series will feature a 53.5% hike in transistor density and a 41% improvement in performance and core energy efficiency. If those numbers hold up under independent verification, and Huawei's previous chip claims have generally been confirmed, if sometimes with caveats about sustained performance under thermal load, the Mate 90 will be the most capable Huawei flagship ever released, launching directly into the same price category and the same consumer consideration set as the iPhone 17. The comparison that reviewers will make when both devices are available is one that Huawei has been building toward since the Mate 60 Pro proved in 2023 that the company had survived the worst that sanctions could do to it. What Huawei has built since 2020, when the full force of US export controls hit and the company appeared to be in terminal decline, is a vertically integrated technology stack that runs from chip design through operating system through hardware manufacturing with less foreign dependency than any major non-American technology company in history has achieved in such a short time. That stack is not as advanced as what Apple commands through its relationship with TSMC and its own silicon design capability. The SMIC 7nm process node remains 3 to 4 generations behind what TSMC produces at 2nm. The performance per watt gap between a Kirin 9020 and an Apple A18 Pro is real and measurable, but the gap is closing. And in China, where government support, nationalist sentiment, domestic ecosystem lock-in, and the specific dynamics of the high-end foldable market all favor Huawei, the question of which company has the better chip is secondary to the question of which company has the better story. Right now, in 2026, Huawei has both the better story and the number one market position. Apple has the better chip and number two. How long each company holds those rankings will tell us a great deal about whether the most consequential technology competition of the decade is ultimately settled by engineering or by politics. The Xiaomi dimension of this story also deserves attention because Xiaomi is doing something in China that complicates the Huawei-Apple binary in ways that the headline market share numbers do not fully capture. Xiaomi continues to charge into the high-end market, betting on a smartphone, car, and home ecosystem. In 2025, the Xiaomi 17 series aimed to target the high-end segment above 4,000 yuan by fully competing with the iPhone. In 2026, increasing the average selling price of mobile phones was listed as the primary operational goal. Xiaomi's entry into automobile manufacturing, the Xiaomi SU7, electric vehicle launched in 2024 to extraordinary consumer response, has created a flywheel effect where smartphone users become car buyers, and car buyers become smartphone users, all within an integrated ecosystem that shares the same user accounts, the same data infrastructure, and the same brand identity. That is not a strategy Apple has replicated in China, where regulatory and partner constraints prevent it from building the kind of cross-category ecosystem that Xiaomi is developing. It is also not a strategy Huawei has ignored. HarmonyOS explicitly connects smartphones to cars, to home appliances, to wearables. But Huawei's car ambitions have taken a different form through partnerships with automakers rather than building its own vehicle. The Chinese premium consumer of 2026 is increasingly choosing between entire ecosystem bets, not individual products, and both Huawei and Xiaomi have structured their businesses around that reality in ways that Apple has not fully matched in the specific context of China. The software gap between Harmony OS and iOS deserves a more honest assessment than it typically receives in Western technology media, which tends to evaluate both operating systems against the benchmark of the global app ecosystem, where iOS and Android are the only meaningful choices. In China, that global benchmark is less relevant. The Chinese app ecosystem operates largely independently from the global one. WeChat, Alipay, Meituan, Douyin, Taobao, and the other dominant Chinese applications that structure daily digital life in China are all available on Harmony OS. The absence of Google services on Harmony OS, which would be a crippling limitation outside China, is essentially irrelevant to Chinese consumers who do not use Google services and whose entire digital life is already contained within Chinese platforms that operate comfortably on Huawei's ecosystem. The competitive gap between Harmony OS and iOS is real in terms of developer tooling, third-party app breadth, and cross-border functionality. Within the Chinese domestic software ecosystem specifically, that gap is considerably narrower than the global picture suggests. Like and subscribe, because what happens with the Mate 90 launch and the new Kirin chip in the second half of 2026 will determine whether Huawei maintains its market share lead over Apple, or whether Apple's Q1 2026 surge, growing 25% year over year in a declining market, represents the beginning of a reversal. Analysts expect Chinese smartphone sales to fall by 10% overall in 2026 compared to 2025. In a market declining at that rate, both companies growing at 20 to 25% means they are taking share from everyone else simultaneously, primarily from Xiaomi, Oppo, and Vivo, whose combined position in the Chinese market has been compressed, between the two premium leaders at the top and the budget segment at the bottom. The consolidation of the Chinese smartphone market into a Huawei-Apple duopoly at the premium tier is one of the most significant structural shifts in the global smartphone industry in the current decade. Samsung, the company that spent years as the dominant global smartphone manufacturer, has been effectively eliminated from premium consideration in the world's largest market. No other competitor has the brand positioning, the ecosystem depth, or the government relationship necessary to break into the top tier. The premium Chinese smartphone market in 2026 is a two-company race. One of those companies is the most valuable company in world history. The other was declared dead 6 years ago. The fact that the declared dead company is winning on its home court tells you something important about how those declarations tend to age in technology competition. And the fact that the most valuable company in history is fighting hard for second place in China tells you something important about what the next 5 years of global smartphone competition are likely to look like. The question of what Apple does next in China has three structural dimensions. The first is accelerating the India manufacturing shift, reducing the vulnerability that comes from building products in a competitor's home market supply chain. That transition is underway but slow, constrained by the complexity of replicating what took decades and hundreds of thousands of specialized workers to build. The second is entering the foldable market, releasing a foldable iPhone that competes directly with Huawei's most aspirational product category. Supply chain reports as of mid-2026 suggest Apple is developing foldable hardware, but no confirmed timeline exists for China specifically. The third is deepening service, lock-in through Apple Music, Apple Pay, iCloud, and cross-device features that make leaving iOS expensive, a strategy that works as long as Chinese regulators do not restrict Apple's service operations. None of those responses reverses the fundamental competitive reality of 2026, which is that Huawei has reemerged as a credible competitor at every price point where Apple competes. The company that was supposed to disappear has instead built a domestic chip capability, a domestic OS, a domestic ecosystem, and a manufacturing supply chain that collectively represent the most serious challenge to Apple's China position the company has ever faced. Not because any individual Huawei product beats any Apple product on objective specs, but because the combination of national support, ecosystem integration, and genuine technological progress has made Huawei competitive in a way that cannot be addressed by any single product improvement. That is what makes this story about more than phones.